Hi everyone, my name is Mark, and today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. On June 5th, 2002, 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart slept in her bed in the affluent town of Federal Heights in Salt Lake City, Utah. Elizabeth and her sister, Mary Catherine, shared a bedroom at the time. However, their peaceful slumber would soon be shattered. As the night progressed, a soft-spoken man forced open a window in the girl's room armed with a knife. This intrusion awoke Mary Catherine, but she pretended to be asleep, hoping to protect her sister. The man then turned to Elizabeth and ordered her to be quiet or else he would harm her. Terrified, Elizabeth complied with his demands, putting shoes on before being taken outside the home. Meanwhile, Mary Catherine lay still, waiting for 2 hours before finally waking their parents, Ed and Lois Smart. She told them someone had taken Elizabeth, but her parents initially didn't believe her. Ed and Lois dismissed her claims, thinking that perhaps Mary Catherine was dreaming. However, as events unfolded, they took their daughter's story seriously. After inspecting Elizabeth and Mary Catherine's bedroom, Ed and Lois discovered a cut window screen, confirming Mary Catherine's story. Worried about Elizabeth, Ed and Lois immediately contacted the authorities. The police arrived at the Smart family home and questioned Mary Catherine about the man who had abducted Elizabeth from their bedroom. Mary Catherine described the man as having dark hair and noticed dark hair on his arms and the backs of his hands. Despite speaking quietly to Elizabeth throughout the incident, Mary Catherine was still able to identify his voice as somehow familiar. However, she struggled to remember any specific circumstances she could have heard before. About 3.5 hours after Elizabeth was taken, the authorities utilized the Rachel Alert system to broadcast information about her abduction to the public. The Rachel Alert was named after another Utah girl who was abducted and murdered. By utilizing this alert system, the authorities could quickly reach a wide audience and enlist the public's aid in locating Elizabeth. Because Ed and Lois Smart had put their house up for sale before Elizabeth was taken from her bedroom on June 5, 2002, the police looked at people who toured the house as possible suspects in Elizabeth's abduction. In addition to the house tour, the police also searched the Smart family's computer. They wanted to uncover any online interactions Elizabeth may have had with strangers, as this was a common tactic used in child abduction cases. By examining her computer records, they hoped to determine if she had come into contact with anyone who may have known or been involved in the abduction. The day after Elizabeth was kidnapped, her parents went on national television and pleaded for her safe return. In a heart-wrenching and emotional appeal, Ed Smart addressed the perpetrator directly, imploring them to bring their daughter home. His voice filled with desperation and love, he pleaded with the person responsible for taking Elizabeth to have mercy and return her safely. Tears accompanied Ed's plea as he spoke about his immense love for his daughter and his unwavering commitment to finding her. When the police spoke to Elizabeth Smart's neighbors in Federal Heights, none of them reported seeing or hearing anything suspicious on the day Elizabeth was abducted. This lack of information surprised the police, as they had hoped to gather more information to assist with the investigation. Shortly after Elizabeth's abduction, the mayor of Salt Lake City, Rocky Anderson, made a public announcement offering a $10,000 reward for her safe return to her family. However, the reward was soon raised to $250,000. Nearly 1,200 volunteers joined Elizabeth Smart's family and friends to search for her. At a news conference, police told the public despite the thousands of tips they were receiving, they were making little headway in Elizabeth's abduction. The authorities in Salt Lake City called in help from other police departments across the state. However, without evidence like a vehicle description, there wasn't a lot of information to go on. With no leads in Elizabeth's disappearance, the police began to get frustrated with the lack of progress in her case. Scott Atkinson, the captain of the Salt Lake City Police Department, told the public that everyone was still a suspect in Elizabeth's abduction. Yet, he reiterated Elizabeth's family was not the focus of the investigation. One of the 1,200 volunteers searching for Elizabeth alerted the police to a suspicious man she saw while she was looking through a wooded canyon for Elizabeth. The volunteer described the man as being in the area and acting suspiciously. This information prompted the police to begin a search for the man. The search lasted all night long, But despite their efforts, the police were unable to locate the suspicious individual. As a result, they ruled the tip out and determined that it was not credible. Another tip received by the police regarding Elizabeth's abduction came from the local milkman in Federal Heights. The milkman claimed to have witnessed a man driving an older gray Honda or Nissan on Elizabeth Street a day or two before her disappearance. He told the police that he had a peculiar feeling about the driver of the car and decided to write down the license plate number. When the police thoroughly searched their vehicle database for that specific license plate number, they came up empty-handed. Unable to find any relevant information or leads, they dismissed the tip as not viable. The police officers investigating the abduction of Elizabeth Smart encountered a significant challenge due to the large number of individuals who showed up at the Smart residence in the hours following her abduction. By the time the police arrived at the scene around 4 a.m., the home was already filled with numerous individuals, causing potential contamination of any possible evidence that may have been present. As the search for Elizabeth Smart continued, the police questioned a man who had contact with Elizabeth at a social function before her abduction. However, they soon released this person and determined they had no connection with Elizabeth's disappearance. The search efforts intensified, and over 20 volunteer pilots in their private planes searched the Salt Lake area from the skies. Yet their efforts yielded no results. Tracking dogs indicated they had smelled something in Red Butte Canyon, several miles from Elizabeth's home. Police searched that area, but it turned out to be a dead end. Elizabeth's father, Ed Smart, had reached the point of exhaustion during the search for his daughter. He collapsed from the strain and had to be taken to the hospital. However, a few hours later, he was released and determined to continue looking for his daughter. Ed Smart and his wife had not been able to sleep and were utterly exhausted by the ordeal. In a media interview, Ed Smart expressed his frustration and determination to find his daughter, stating that he and his wife were barely holding it together. Despite Elizabeth's parents' exhaustion while they looked for her, Ed and Lois Smart held out hope their daughter was alive. They firmly believed in their unwavering belief that Elizabeth was going to come home to them. This conviction was instilled deep within their hearts. Elizabeth's mother, Lois Smart, expressed her love and commitment to her daughter through the media. She said in a powerful and emotional statement, "Elizabeth, if you can hear us, we love you." Elizabeth's loved ones held a candlelight vigil, praying for her to return home safely. In response to the abduction, the police requested Elizabeth's father, Ed, to take a polygraph test. Ed willingly complied with the request, demonstrating his family's commitment to aiding the authorities in finding their daughter. Her family was more than willing to do whatever was necessary to help the investigation. The investigation into Elizabeth's abduction ruled out the possibility that she had staged her disappearance, and they determined that she had not run away. Mark Kloss, whose daughter was kidnapped and murdered in California in October 1993, reached out to Elizabeth's family to offer his support. He traveled to Utah to speak with Ed and Lois Smart, sharing his own experiences and insights to help them navigate the challenging circumstances they were facing. During an interview with the media, Mark Kloss highlighted how the internet had benefited Elizabeth's disappearance. He stated that with the internet, the police were able to quickly and effectively spread the word about Elizabeth's missing person flyer, as this allowed them to reach a wider audience and alert people in different states, increasing the chances of finding her. The police soon received information that a man named Brett Michael Edmonds had been sighted in Federal Heights around the time Elizabeth was abducted. This information led detectives to seek Brett for questioning. However, their search for Brett proved unsuccessful, as they could not find him anywhere. As the investigation continued, the police discovered that Brett had relocated to New Mexico and Texas. A chase ensued, and authorities eventually apprehended a man they believed to be Brett at a department store. The individual was arrested on charges of auto theft and shoplifting. However, upon further investigation, it was determined that he was not Brett Michael Edmonds. Despite the physical similarities, the man was determined to have had no connection to Elizabeth's case. Eventually, the police found Brett Michael Edmonds in West Virginia, where he was admitted to the hospital due to an overdose and liver failure. Brett's health was so critical that the authorities feared he might not survive. However, his condition allowed for the possibility of questioning him regarding Elizabeth's abduction. Brett was conscious, alert, and able to speak, which presented an opportunity for the police and FBI agents working on the case to interview him. He was cooperative with the police, and the police concluded that Brett had nothing to do with the abduction. After Brett Michael Edmonds was cleared as a suspect in Elizabeth's abduction, the police turned their attention to 48-year-old Richard Albert Ricci. Ed Smart, Elizabeth's father, informed the police that he had employed Richard at his home for 2 months the previous year. According to Ed, because Richard did not own a vehicle, they worked out a deal where Ed would give Richard his 1990 Jeep Cherokee in exchange for his labor. However, Ed Smart was unaware that Richard Ricci was a career criminal, and he later stated that he would not have hired Richard if he had known about his background. Richard Ricci's criminal history dates back to 1973, when he was convicted of second-degree felony burglary. This robbery marked the beginning of a string of offenses over several decades. In 1981, Ricci was again convicted of burglary for a separate incident. His most serious crime occurred in 1983 when he was sent to prison for aggravated robbery and attempted murder. The conviction resulted from an incident where he wounded a police officer during a gunfire exchange with authorities during a drugstore robbery. Additionally, Richard Ricci was convicted of theft in 1996 for stealing about $2,500 worth of food from a food pantry in Richfield. According to corrections records, Richard Ricci was paroled in September 2000. In an interview with the media, Ed Smart expressed his doubts about Richard Ricci's involvement in his daughter's abduction. Ed stated that despite Ricci's criminal history, he initially found Ricci to be a capable worker. On June 14, 2002, Richard Ricci was arrested on a parole violation, and the police were unable to confirm his whereabouts on the day Elizabeth was abducted. However, Richard Ricci denied any involvement in Elizabeth's abduction. Through a statement from his attorney, Richard Ricci informed the public that the police conducted an exhaustive search of his home, even digging up his garden. However, no evidence related to Elizabeth's abduction was found. Richard Ricci claimed that he cooperated fully with the police, providing them with blood samples for DNA comparison, and sat through 26 hours of interviews. He also surrendered his vehicle to the police for investigation. By July 2002, Elizabeth Smart had been missing for a month, and her family desperately longed for her to return home. They thought their prayers were answered when police received a report of a girl who matched Elizabeth's description being sighted in Nebraska under suspicious circumstances. A witness at a gas station claimed to have seen a crying girl between the ages of 12 and 14 who seemed to be held against her will in a minivan. The witness provided a detailed description of the girl, which matched Elizabeth's appearance. This new development sent shockwaves through the Smart family as they eagerly hoped for any lead that might lead to finding their missing daughter. However, the police investigation into the report revealed that it had nothing to do with Elizabeth's abduction. After a thorough search, the police found insufficient evidence to connect the sighting to Elizabeth's case. This disappointing discovery left the Smart family grappling with a mix of emotions as they continued to hope for Elizabeth's safe return while acknowledging the potential for false leads. Despite the setback, the Smart family remained steadfast in their determination to find Elizabeth. They maintained a cautious optimism, stating that while they were not ruling out the possibility that the girl at the gas station could be Elizabeth, they needed to keep an open mind. The family spokesperson expressed, "We're not necessarily holding out hope it is Elizabeth. If it is Elizabeth, we'd be elated." Meanwhile, the main suspect in Elizabeth's disappearance, Richard Ricci, was charged with theft and burglary. He pleaded not guilty to the charges. These charges were filed in 2 incidents involving residences in the Federal Heights neighborhood and the Smart family home. Richard Ricci was accused of committing burglary, a second-degree felony, and theft, a Class A misdemeanor, in the theft of items from a Federal Heights house on April 4, 2001. Additionally, Richard Ricci was charged with theft, a third-degree felony, in the robbery of items from the Smart house on June 6, 2001. The stolen items were not related to Elizabeth's kidnapping investigation. Salt Lake District Attorney David Yoakum held a press conference to announce the charges. He stated that the stolen items from the Smart house included jewelry and a perfume bottle valued at approximately $3,500. When Ed Smart confronted Richard Ricci about the theft, Richard denied the allegations and was subsequently fired. Unfortunately, the police investigation into the abduction of Elizabeth Smart suffered a significant setback in August 2002 when their best lead, Richard Ricci, passed away from an irreversible injury to his brainstem that caused hemorrhaging. Richard Ricci's condition deteriorated significantly, and he eventually lost the ability to communicate or breathe on his own. As a result, his family made the difficult decision to remove him from a ventilator. In an effort to save Ricci's life, doctors operated to remove a blood clot in his brain and alleviate the pressure on his brain stem. Unfortunately, the damage had already been done, and the efforts were unsuccessful. Despite the loss of Richard Ricci, the authorities continued their efforts to locate and apprehend those responsible for the abduction. However, Ricci's death presented a significant challenge in the investigation and the search for Elizabeth Smart's abductor. The loss of the prime suspect hindered the progress of their case and cast doubt upon the viability of other leads. In August 2002, an 11-year-old girl was sexually assaulted and beaten after she was taken from her bedroom. The severity of her injuries was unimaginable, as doctors at the hospital discovered that every bone in the middle of her face had been broken. She had to undergo surgery, but unfortunately, her condition remained critical. Following the assault, police arrested a close friend of the girl's father, Javier Sickler. He was charged with aggravated burglary, aggravated assault, and attempted murder. According to Javier Sickler, he recalled knocking on the front door of the victim's home, but claimed that he blacked out afterward. However, despite the initial similarities with the abduction of Elizabeth Smart, the police determined that Javier Sickler had nothing to do with her kidnapping. As the months continued to pass and Elizabeth Smart remained missing, the police investigating the abduction turned to unconventional methods in their attempt to find her. Among these methods was the use of psychics, individuals who claimed to be able to use extrasensory perception to gain information about the missing girl's location. The psychics provided information to investigators, suggesting that Elizabeth could be found entombed in a crypt in the foothills above Salt Lake City. This tip prompted officials from a company in Seattle to report that more than a dozen of its members had located Elizabeth's body through a special psychic process called technical remote viewing. According to the members of the Seattle-based group, their psychic abilities allowed them to determine Elizabeth had been killed within hours of her abduction. However, upon arriving at the designated tomb, the officers found no signs of Elizabeth's disappearance. In November 2002, a man by the name of Walter Kenneth Holloway was arrested and accused of extortion. Walter Holloway had contacted the Smart family and the Salt Lake Police Department, claiming to be the kidnapper of their daughter, Elizabeth. He demanded $3 million from Ed and Lois Smart for the safe return of their daughter, and threatened to harm Elizabeth if he did not receive the money. However, the police were able to track Holloway to South Carolina and determined that he had no involvement in the abduction. Ed Smart later stated that he was sickened by the extortion scheme and felt furious because it diverted the police's attention away from finding his daughter. The false kidnapping allegations had hindered their efforts and dedicated resources that could have been better utilized in finding Elizabeth. In October 2002, Elizabeth Smart's sister, Mary Catherine, suddenly realized that the abductor's voice was that of an unemployed man the family knew as Emmanuel. The family had hired Emmanuel to work on the roof and rake leaves in their yard for a day. However, the police officers were skeptical due to the short time Emmanuel had worked for the family, the long time that elapsed between the abduction and the revelation, and the limited time Mary Catherine had heard the abductor's voice. Despite the doubts, the family had a sketch artist draw Emmanuel's face from their descriptions. The sketch was eventually released in February 2003 and featured on several television shows, including Larry King Live and America's Most Wanted. The drawing of a suspect that was released by the police was recognized by relatives of a man named Brian David Mitchell, who provided the police with contemporary photographs of him. These photographs helped authorities confirm that the sketch was indeed an accurate depiction of Brian David Mitchell. On March 12, 2003, two couples in Sandy, Utah spotted Brian David Mitchell with a woman and a girl. They recognized Brian David Mitchell from the photos they had seen on the news, which depicted him as the missing girl's abductor. The woman accompanying Brian David Mitchell was later identified as his wife, Wanda Barzee. One of the couples called the police immediately after recognizing them. The police department was immediately notified and dispatched police officers to the location. Upon questioning, Elizabeth Smart, the missing girl from Salt Lake City, was identified. The officers rescued her and arrested both Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee. After Elizabeth was rescued, her testimony revealed a shocking account of her abduction, abuse, and captivity. Elizabeth was taken to an encampment outside of Salt Lake City when Brian David Mitchell took her out of her home. The camp consisted of a makeshift shelter surrounded by dense foliage to provide camouflage. Here she first met Wanda Barzee, Brian David Mitchell's wife, who would play a significant role in her captivity. According to Elizabeth Smart's testimony, Wanda Barzee initially played the role of a maternal figure, offering her comfort and warmth. However, as the days turned into weeks, Wanda Barzee's demeanor began to change. She began to exert control over Elizabeth, demanding that she adhere to their bizarre religious beliefs. Wanda Barzee would force Elizabeth to pray, read scriptures, and participate in religious rituals. One of the most traumatic experiences Elizabeth faced during her captivity was being forced to marry Brian David Mitchell. Wanda Barzee threatened Elizabeth with physical harm if she did not comply with their demands. The wedding ceremony, which Mitchell described as a ceremony of eternal love, was a sham. It had no legal standing and served only as a symbol of Brian David Mitchell's control over Elizabeth. Following the forced marriage, Brian David Mitchell proceeded to assault Elizabeth. He justified his actions by claiming that he was a Davidic king who had been commanded to kidnap virgin brides in order to fight against the Antichrist. Brian David Mitchell insisted that Elizabeth was the first of many virgins he would abduct, and that she would accompany him as he battled this mythical figure. Elizabeth Smart endured unimaginable abuse during her captivity. In order to prevent her from escaping, she was shackled to a tree with a metal cable, which severely limited her mobility outside of the tent she occupied. This constant confinement prevented her from seeking freedom and left her feeling trapped and helpless. In addition to the physical restraint, Elizabeth was also subjected to psychological torment. She was forced to take a new name and chose the name Esther, after Esther of the Old Testament. The name change was a symbol of the loss of her identity and the manipulation and control exerted over her by Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee. One of the most disturbing aspects of Elizabeth's captivity was the repeated sexual assault she survived at the hands of Brian David Mitchell. She was forced to endure these assaults multiple times a day, leaving her traumatized and fearful. In addition to sexual abuse, Elizabeth was made to look at explicit magazines, further exacerbating her trauma and degradation. Elizabeth was constantly threatened with violence and even death. Brian David Mitchell regularly threatened to kill her, leaving her in a constant state of fear and anxiety. The constant fear and uncertainty only intensified the abuse she endured, leaving her feeling overwhelmed and helpless. In order to further weaken her resistance, Mitchell often forced Elizabeth to drink alcohol and take drugs. These substances were used as a means to lower her resistance and make it easier for him to control her. The constant intoxication left her disoriented and vulnerable, making it easier for the abusers to carry out their horrific acts. Elizabeth was also starved and fed garbage by her captors. After her rescue, Elizabeth called Wanda Barzee the most evil woman she had ever met. After years of legal proceedings, Wanda Barzee pleaded guilty to all the charges stemming from Elizabeth's abduction and was sentenced to concurrent terms of 15 years in state and federal prison. In 2016, her federal imprisonment was terminated, and she was transferred from the Federal Medical Center, Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, to the Utah State Prison in Draper, Utah, to begin serving her state prison sentence. Elizabeth Smart protested the release of Wanda Barzee in September 2018, but Wanda Barzee was still let out. Elizabeth Smart, who by the time of Wanda Barzzi's release was an advocate for child safety, stated that she believed Wanda Barzzi still had the potential to harm others. She argued that Barzzi had not demonstrated remorse for her actions or any signs of rehabilitation. Her protest garnered attention in the media and highlighted the ongoing concerns surrounding the release of convicted criminals. After a long legal battle that spanned several years, Brian David Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison for the kidnapping of Elizabeth Smart. During the sentencing hearing, Elizabeth had the opportunity to address her kidnapper directly. In a powerful and emotional statement, she expressed the pain and trauma he had caused her. She told him that the 9 months she spent in captivity had taken away a part of her life that she could never regain. Despite this ordeal, Elizabeth showed remarkable resilience and determination. She assured her kidnapper that she would lead a good life despite the darkness he had brought into her life. Elizabeth's words reflected her strength and determination to overcome her challenges. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more true crime content.